So I would invite Professor Vick Ssali, President of JSAS. He gives opening remarks. Ssali Sensei, please switch on your video and mic, and could you give the opening remarks, please?
Thank you, Hanai Sensei. Thank you, everyone, for coming today. I welcome everyone to this special workshop towards understanding grassroots perspectives in 6 African countries under COVID-19. My name is Vick Ssali, and I come from Uganda and currently teaching at the Department of English Language and the British Commonwealth Cultures at Aichi Gakuin University in central Japan. I'm also the founding and current president of this Japan Society of Afrasian Studies. JSAS, as we call ourselves, was founded only 3 years ago. And our main goal was promoting intercultural, intergenerational, and interdisciplinary dialogue on issues affecting Africa and Asia. Our secondary goal as JSAS was to open up gates of opportunities for a limitless future of collaboration among African scholars in Asia, African students in Japan and Asia, and Asian scholars, professors, and students of Africa, especially those using English, among other languages, as their main language of research. So here we are in our 3rd year, and we are not letting down even in the midst of the pandemic. This is our 3rd webinar focusing on this unprecedented event of our lifetime. But even before COVID, JSAS was already steadily navigating several themes and research opportunities, as well as means of influencing policy on Afrasian relations and on the development and human rights challenges facing these 2 giant continents. If you are new to our society, please take a look at our homepage, follow our activities more, and indeed, you're welcome to join us for this noble cause. I would like to thank our Vice President, Dr. Hanai Kazuyo, and her support team at the University of Tokyo for not only proposing this cross-continental research project, but also she's working very hard on the ongoing grant application. It was also through her practical wisdom that we are here today to give hints on what we African scholars in Japan, as well as our Japanese colleagues, can take on as research projects in our respective countries to ensure a better informed approach to pandemics and other such events in the near and distant futures. Dr. Hanai's own presentation is an overview of these collaborative projects and the pandemic situation in Africa. I would also like to thank the SDGs collaborative research at the Institute of Future Initiatives at the University of Tokyo for making today's workshop possible. Asante sana to the director and to IFI at large. Thank you very much. Thank you also to our 2nd Vice President, Dr. Kinyua of Sophia University, to our treasurer, Dr. Munemura of Chiba Keiser University. We call them the Kanto team, and we thank you for your support, Dr. Hanai, for making this event possible. All the team leaders for the 6 countries and our presenters today, thank you very much for the time you have put in to prepare for this event. Last but not least, a big thank you to our commentators for today. Professor Scarlet Cornelissen, a currently visiting professor to Tokyo University of Foreign Studies, normally based at Stellenbosch University in South Africa, not only agreed to be a commentator, but also will tell us about the responses to COVID-19 in the Republic of South Africa. Mr. Masaki Inaba of the Africa-Japan Forum, you always support our activities and you give us a good balance with informed views from the civil society. Thank you very much. Thank you both. Thank you all. And I wish you an informative workshop and a way out for all of us out of the COVID-19 conundrum. I wish you a good event. I thank you.
Thank you, Sai Sensei. So, as the first presentation, then I'd like to overview the situation. I will share the screen. Thank you, Sai Sensei. I'd like to move on to my presentation. Then, okay. Yeah. I will give my presentation on the overview of pandemic and government responses to COVID-19 in 6 African countries. In this fiscal year, as Sari Sensei mentioned, the JSAS members have launched a research project related to COVID-19. The project of our subject of our project is exploration of practical wisdom and resilience overcoming downside risk, collecting grassroots voices in Africa after COVID-19. We have 2 primary purposes for this research project. First, we will classify and assess the real and perceived risk associated with both COVID-19 and the government response to the pandemic in African countries. As you know, even in Japan, the repeated declaration of state of emergency and prolonged activity restrictions have left many people in economic distress. In Africa as well, many people live under pressure, not only the pandemic itself, but also the government's response to the pandemic. In addition, risk perception affects people's behavior. So we will investigate the real and perceived risk of grassroots people. And the second purpose is to elucidate the people's resilience in overcoming the risks. We believe that people can overcome this pandemic and the destruction of life in the future, so we will investigate the process and origin of the people's resilience. As for the method, we constructed research groups in 6 target countries in collaboration with local research institute and plan to collect grassroots voices from private mobile communication applications, including Twitter and WhatsApp. Research countries are South Africa, Democratic Republic of Congo, Ethiopia, Kenya, Uganda, and Zimbabwe. As today's seminar is the kick-off of our research project, we cannot provide the outcome of our research at this point. Instead, 6 researchers from the target countries will share the current situation in the countries. Through the presentation, getting comments from commentators and discussion with participants, we would like to provide an opportunity to identify what types of research or policy are needed in Africa. Then, as an overview, I would share the basic situation of 6 target countries. As of today, the total number of confirmed COVID-19 cases in Africa is around 7.7 million. Compared to the other part of the world, this number does not appear so huge. However, we need to consider the concerns specific to Africa, which are result not only the pandemic, but also of government responses. Even though the WHO, UN, and regional institutions are making massive efforts, African countries continue to face difficulties. These graphs show the confirmed cases and the deaths in our 6 target countries. As you see, most of them are in the 3rd wave of pandemic. since June. Even in Uganda and Zimbabwe, where relatively few infections have been observed, the unprecedented spread of the disease occurs. Moreover, vaccination in African countries has not progressed. For example, while the Zimbabwe and South Africa have vaccination rates of about 20%, the other four countries have less than 10%, and the rate in the DR Congo is as low as 0.09%. I would point out four concerns about people's lives under this situation. The first concern is about the low level of preparedness to COVID-19. Sub-Saharan Africa countries have only fragile health systems. The number of medical doctors and hospital beds and the infrastructure are not adequate even in normal times. According to WHO and UNICEF, only 34% of the population in Africa has access to hand-washing facilities. How can people respond to the pandemic with this poor sanitary equipment? The second concern is about government responses to the pandemic. From the beginning of this global pandemic, there was public concern that if COVID-19 spread anywhere in Africa, the situation would become unmanageable. Therefore, many African governments implemented strict prevention policies, including border closure, lockdown, curfew, and staying home at the very early stage. Indeed, to a certain extent, these policies prevented the inflow of COVID-19 cases. However, the side effects have been severe. Most locals earn their livelihood through the informal economy. This includes selling agricultural products at local market and purchasing commercial products imported through informal trade from neighboring countries. Therefore, the restrictions of transportation have had a severe impact on local people's livelihoods. In addition, how can people earn an income from home? In some, the COVID-19 containment policies can result in hunger for local people. In many African countries, people cannot emphasize enough that because of the containment policies, hunger will kill them before the virus does. The third concern is the lockdown abuse by governmental officials. This graph shows the amount of violence by police in South Africa. After the implementation of lockdown in March, violence within the context of COVID-19 policing increased. Police officers strictly enforced their rules using violence in many African countries. As a result of this abuse of power, there is a growing distrust of the government. In some countries, there are reports of concern that the rumor that corona does not exist is spreading on social media, that making people more susceptible to COVID-19 without heeding their doctor's advice. This distrust will affect the success or failure of the containment policies and vaccine promotion. This is a reason our research project focused on perception. Lastly, I would point out that in addition to COVID-19, there are other infectious diseases in Africa. In case of DR Congo, since 2018, the eastern part of the country has been affected by the Ebola epidemic. Ebola, which has a very high death rate, has resulted in 2,287 fatalities. In addition, as in other African countries, Congolese people have been plagued by malaria for a long time. In 2018 alone, there were more than 27 million cases of Africa with 44,000 deaths. There is a possibility that deaths due to malaria will increase because people are avoiding going to hospital during COVID-19 pandemic. The graph on the right shows excess deaths during the pandemic in South Africa. Excess deaths refers to the number of deaths from the all causes during a crisis above and beyond what we would have expected to see under normal conditions. It is very difficult to estimate exists this in African countries other than South Africa, but we can probably assume that this is getting worse in other countries as well. So I stop my overview here. As for more details, panelists from 6 countries will give in our 2 sessions. In the first session, Professor Cornelissen from South Africa, Professor Otchia from DR Congo, and Professor Adem from Ethiopia explain their country's current situation and concerns. And Inaba-san from Africa-Japan Forum will give comments. After that, we have the time for Q&A. In the second session, Professor Ssali from Uganda, Dr. Kisinji from Kenya, and Dr. Mujetu explain their country's situation. And Professor Cornelissen will give comments, but there is a possibility that Professor Cornelissen should leave this seminar after the first session. But in that case, we will move to the Q&A directly. So if you have any questions for the panelists, please write them in the Q&A box. So thank you for listening. I stop my presentation. Thank you. Then, I would invite Professor Scarlet Cornelissen as our first speaker. Scarlet Sensei is a professor in the Department of Political Science at Stellenbosch University in South Africa. She works in the field of international relations, specifically topics related to the political economy of Africa's relations with East Asia. Okay, Scarlet Sensei, so you have the floor.
All right, thank you, Professor Hanai, and thank you to Professor Ssali for organizing this important event and for inviting me to be part of the panel this evening. So I know the time is short, so I'm going to get right into it. Talking about COVID-19 in South Africa and what the impacts have been over the past year and a half. When JSAS organized last year for the 2020 conference of JSAS, organized the whole webinar on the potential impacts of COVID-19 and COVID-19's implications for Africa. I was also one of those panelists, and I was starting my talk last year with this point about how COVID has spread very differently over the globe, but that there are important common aspects or generic aspects, so that is commonly experienced by all countries and all societies in the world. So the 4 dimensions that are commonly experienced, COVID being a global public health crisis, that it's also provoked an economic crisis over 2 dimensions, and that it's also a societal or welfare crisis because it is also engendering the spread of social precarity. And then also what we didn't expect from COVID, but that which became very visible very early on in the pandemic, is that COVID really just exposed all of the societal fault lines, all of the inequalities that were existing within societies and between societies. That is what COVID had shown us. Now I want to return to these 4 points that I raised last year, because given our discussion about resilience and how communities might be able to build resilience to COVID's impacts, I think it is important to remind ourselves that the differential impacts that the pandemic have produced, that it has developed over phases, and that consequently people have been experiencing these phases differently. And they've also been building resilience, or have been using resilience over these different phases differently. So that's just a kind of a conceptual point that I want to raise as a lead into our discussion about communal or societal resilience, which is the main focus of the whole project. So this is Professor Hanai gave some of the information about the current COVID situation in the 6 African countries that the project is looking at. This is the statistics for South Africa from the 29th of August. So as Professor Hanai has said, we have had South Africa has had 3 waves since March 2020, and it seems as if the 3 waves had become deadlier and longer with every successive wave. And currently we in the 3rd wave. The 3rd wave is lasting a lot longer than was anticipated. And where the 3rd wave initially was driven by the Beta variant, which was first detected in South Africa, the Delta variant is now the main driver of the 3rd wave. And as also has been indicated, South Africa has the highest number of positive cases, infections. The infection rate is the highest on the African continent, with about 2.8 million positive cases since the start of the pandemic. And of course, many deaths, which has been quite painful actually for the country. There is the question of whether South Africa's situation, or whether South Africa's statistics, the fact that South Africa is the outlier on the African continent, has something to do with diagnostics. We have more cases because we have a better, or we have a stronger diagnostic system in South Africa, and also because of reporting methods. So there is the issue of making comparisons and then looking at these statistics in a comparative sense. So one does need to get down into the specific context of the case. Basically, I'm dividing my overview into two discussions, or brief discussions. The first is to look at the government, the major government or policy responses to COVID-19. And here I want to talk about the lockdown strategy, and then the COVID grant scheme that the South African government has introduced in an attempt to address some of the socioeconomic impacts of the lockdown as well as the pandemic, and then the vaccine program by South Africa. And then the second dimension, which I will touch on after I've discussed this, is the societal impacts that the pandemic have had. So in terms of the major policy responses by the South African government, this is just a timeline of the lockdown approach that the South African government had been following since the 26th of March 2020. And people don't realize this, but South Africa is still in lockdown. So we today in day 523 of the national lockdown. And even though there had been different alert levels that had been adopted by the South African government, the restrictions under the lockdown have at times been quite severe. So for example, if you look at what the restrictions had been with alert level 5, which was the hard lockdown that the South African government implemented right at the beginning of the outbreak of the pandemic. And then there had been subsequent shifts in gear, one can say, depending on how the epidemiology of the virus or of the pandemic had been progressing. So the important points here to mention about the lockdown strategy. The South African government never foresaw that this would be a long-term thing. And when it became clear that the world is not going to get out of the pandemic very quickly, the South African government then started to adopt approaches that other governments across the world were adopting. In other words, a more flexible kind of, or a flexible alert level kind of lockdown approach. The question of whether the lockdowns worked, that's a question that is debated quite vehemently by the South African public. I must say that in the absence of the lockdown, I don't think, I think that the situation would have been worse, much worse than it actually is in South Africa. So I do think there are certain merits to the lockdown strategy. But as Professor Hanai also pointed out, it's that balancing between lives and livelihoods. And so while lockdowns may save lives, it has had significant impacts on people's livelihoods. Then the two other key policy responses by the South African government. The other one is the what's known as the so-called COVID grant, or the special COVID-19 social relief of distress grant, which the government first announced in May 2020 and which ran until April of this year, where the government basically gave money to persons who qualified for this grant as an attempt that people could at least overcome the biggest challenges regarding the loss of income, loss of employment, loss of livelihood, and so forth. And then the government, so it's a meager amount. It's 350 rand, which doesn't go very far, but still, I think the government paid out with the first iteration something like 24 billion rand, so quite a significant amount of money. But the government didn't intend, again with this, that it would continue indefinitely, and stopped this COVID grant, and it drew quite a lot of criticism, and then we saw last month, we saw that social unrest and the looting and so forth, and then very soon thereafter the government decided to reintroduce the social or the COVID grant. But whether it is something that can actually be maintained for a significant period of time is also unclear. And also there have been problems with the administration of this COVID grant. So the point is, rather than being something that actually seems to help people, the COVID grant has become a point of tension, or a point of criticism, further criticism against the South African government reaction to the pandemic. And then the third major policy response has been the vaccine program. So as of today, it's just under a quarter of South Africa's population, adult population, have been vaccinated. I don't think one should be overly critical of the slow pace of vaccination in South Africa, because I think mistakes had been made. For example, the South African government was very slow in procuring vaccines at the end of last year. So that was a big mistake that was made. But also mistakes were made by all governments in implementation and distribution. So the vaccination program is starting to pick up now. And part of that has to do with vaccine hesitancy being overcome, as people are really experiencing loss of the loss of life of family members and so on now, especially with the third wave. And also the private sector has stepped in as well, and that has given a push to the implementation of the vaccine program. Stellenbosch University, for example, has its own vaccination terrain for the university community as well as for the public at large. So it is starting to look a bit better now. Just with the last few minutes that I have, I just want to talk about some of the major socioeconomic impacts of the pandemic. Again, I don't want to make a distinction about whether these impacts are as a result of the pandemic or of the lockdowns or the combination of it. I think just that the socioeconomic impacts in and of themselves are quite distressing when one looks at some of these indicators. So I've just picked up on 3 indicators. The one is on employment, which is on the chart on the left hand is showing the impact on employment and how during the time of the pandemic unemployment has actually, adult unemployment has actually increased dramatically, and youth unemployment has increased even more dramatically. So certainly loss of employment, loss of income, and these are structural issues. These are things that can't be mended with just a 350 Rand grant. You know, so these are things that will have long-term effects and need long-term ways of dealing with this particular structural challenge. The other socioeconomic impact is on food security, food insecurity. So food hunger, poverty has been increasing. Hunger has also been increasing. And now I talk from experience here. So it's not people who are the poorest of the poor who, of course, have been very negatively affected during the time of the pandemic, but it's middle-class families that are not able to meet their nutritional needs. So again, this potential of food insecurity becoming a not only a cyclical but a structural societal challenge. And then the third indicator, socioeconomic impact indicator on education. And what we've seen with schools, for example, is that the school dropout rate has significantly increased. So during the lockdown, schools were closed, and when there was the fear, are children going to be going back to school or not? And now we're seeing the figures from household level surveys this year, and it's showing massive school dropout rates. So again, these are all things that are not short-term challenges. They are all long-term structural challenges. So then the pandemic exposed and worsened the structural fault lines in South African society. But also it's important to understand that while everyone is adversely impacted, the suffering is unevenly spread. And this has to be taken into consideration when we reflect about how communities build resilience. So then this is my last slide, and just the 4 kind of theoretical conceptual points I want to put on the table. So the first, that COVID's impacts are differentially experienced. And in the South African context, and with the history of segregation in South Africa, all of those things are structural determinants to how people landed. So if you were before the pandemic sort of on the adverse side of the South African political economy, then you would be more harshly impacted. But also, having said that, middle income households and communities have also been harshly impacted. But the difference is that the middle income households would probably have better or more social capital and other coping mechanisms that would enable them to get out of the biggest challenges of this pandemic. But we need to factor in this diversity in terms of geography, class, ethnicity, racial groups, gender, as well as generations. Secondly, that resilience is context-specific and sometimes localized and even intimate. So certainly one thing that I would like to explore in the context of South Africa with this project would be things such as what meanings do people give to resilience and coping? How does that differ, of course, across different levels or different strata of society? How do people experience and give content to coping? And how do cultural values and social institutions shape these? So this is what Professor Hanai means when she talks about the grassroots perspective. Third point is that resilience is inequitable. So the available social, economic, institutional, and other capital that communities have at their disposal as a historically determined factor that frames how communities are able to build robustness and how they can recover. And then the last point, the question of is COVID resilience unique or is it different? So if one were to explore how to explore people or communities coping mechanisms and the narratives of resilience, is it something specific to the COVID situation, which is a very unique situation? Or is it something that people actually can relate to in terms of prior experiences before the pandemic? Thank you. I will leave it there. Thank you, Hanai-san.
Thank you, Scarlet Sensei, to sharing the serious situation in the South Africa and a very important comment to our research project. Thank you very much. Thank you. So then I'd like to invite the second speaker, Professor Christian Otchia. Otchia Sensei is the professor in the Graduate School of International Development at Nagoya University. Otchia Sensei is an expert of development economics. In particular, he focusing on industrial policy and poor growth. Otchia Sensei, you have the floor.
Okay, thank you very much, Hanai Sensei and all the crew for organizing this wonderful seminar. So I'm going to dive in directly discussing the one special case for DRC. And I think as Hanai Sensei has clearly mentioned it, the countries involved in this project are very different, but they have their unique points. And I think these unique points are what we want to focus in this research. So for the case of DRC, and Hanai Sensei clearly mentioned it, DRC is a country where you have several issues that goes together. So you have conflict, you had Ebola, and you have COVID, and you have actually many different conflicts going on in the almost the same regions. So therefore, our cases of DRC will focus on what we call a martial law and try to study how people have been resilient to COVID under the martial law. So let me dive in explaining you what I mean by the martial law. So usually, a simple definition of martial law is that it's the replacement of a civil rule with temporary military authority during a time of crisis. And in the case of DRC, there is an ongoing conflict that has been there for almost 10, 20 years. But at the same time, there are a lot of violence, especially coming from not only in DRC, but neighboring countries as well. So the government, to stop those kind of conflict, decided to set up those martial law in basically two regions. So one region is the North Kivu, I will show you later, and the other one is in Ituri. And the reason is that these are fifth of conflict because there are regions at the border. Therefore, you know, stating the martial law, whereby the civilians, like the governor, the vice governor, are all replaced by military. So now if you go to North Kivu or Ituri, the governor is a general for the army, and the vice governor is a guy from the police. So basically all the governance is held by military, with the need of stopping war. But at the same time, I think that the martial law could have tremendous implication on COVID for the simple reason that under the martial law, usually the military have this right to search people's home, even during the day or even at night. They can ban publication or meeting dimly against public order, or just restricts people's movements. And because the DRC has been actually a field, a place of many conflict. So there is actually many worries that probably those martial law in DRC can, what you call, deprive human right or put human right into jeopardy. So therefore, the question here is to see to what extent DRC could reduce COVID under this martial law. So Hanai says presented a trend of the third wave in DRC. Today, I will focus on the third wave, but breaking down into subnational. Now, the graph on your left-hand side shows you the cumulated cases divided, it's the cumulated cases divided by the population on May 2nd, which is actually the week before the martial law was enacted in DRC. So what we could see here is that there is a tremendous variation in terms of COVID contamination in DRC. So the blue, the highly contaminated regions are at the west part of DRC, which is Kinshasa here, and you have Congo Central, which have the international airport is more open to foreign contact. And in the south, you have the old Shaba, which is highly connected to Zambia, to South Africa. And in the eastern part, you have North Kivu, South Kivu, and Ituri, which are connected to Uganda, to Rwanda, and Burundi. So the regions which have high contaminated cases are basically at the borders, and borders which are connected with good infrastructures to neighboring countries. In the north, basically, there is what you call the equatorial forest, so there is no easy connection with neighboring countries. Therefore, you see small number of cases in COVID. So if you want to do a study in DRC, probably you may want to focus on those regions which have higher cases because they might be interested to study. But what I want to show you today is if you compare the week before the martial rule was stated and the 1st of August, which is the latest date I got the data, you can see that, for example, in North Kivu, the number of cases has increases a lot. So meaning that there are variation even over time among those different provinces. So my question here is that if you look at, these are the variation just in percentage to make you understand those graphs very well. So you can see that there are many regions on 2nd of May which have many small cases. Of course, that has increased that much. So if you see, for example, Ouele, it had 45 cases divided by population, but it increased by 202 percentage points. But if you look at, for example, North Kivu, where I'm focusing, the cases has increased by 91%, but it moved from almost 200 to 556. So which means that the places where the martial law was instated, there are high cases of COVID. So the question is why? And this is probably the question where our research in Congo was going to focus is, first, we want to assess what could be the impact of establishing a martial rule on COVID cases and also vaccination. And in many other countries, even in DRC, we had also lockdown measures, and we have other measures like, basically curfew and everything. But the martial law is very different because it has not been applied to many other countries. So DRC is, I think, a unique case where we can study how military rule could affect the spread of COVID. So I think from the research standpoint, this is a very wonderful case. So what we want to see is what are the mechanisms, like how could those martial rule affect COVID? So one could be through human rights, like people's liberty to move, to go out, but also through conflict, which is one of the main mechanisms. And we're going to use basically secondary data, which I mentioned the source here. And of course, the main objective of our research would be to follow the entire project to see whether the knowledge and I think the wisdom could help the population living in those areas or in other areas to survive what we're calling resilience under COVID. Now, this is just a brief summary because I have 10 minutes. So these are very preliminary results because, as you know, the martial rule was stated on the 6th of May. So there is not much time to understand the impact, but a very small difference analysis, which compare the regions which actually were instated by the martial law with the other regions, the rest of the country, before the martial law was instated and after. So this is a basic way using basic econometrics to see the impact of those martial law. So a quick impact could show us that the effects are not that much positive in reducing the cases of COVID. So we can say for the time being that the martial rule has been not able to reduce or to stop the trend of COVID in the North Kivu and Ituri. So people are calling it a failure, but I think there are many ways to put it on the table. So my discussion today is probably why this impact is not coming up, because in theory, if you instate a martial rule like reducing people's mobility, as we have seen elsewhere, the intuitive result would be to reduce the number of contamination of COVID. But what we see in DRC is it's not happening. So the question is why? So one response is that it's too early to judge. And I said the martial rule was stated on May 6th. So it's too early within few months to judge this effect, even if I'm using weekly data, which is very precise, but I think it's too early. Now, the second reason is maybe the volcanic eruption. And if you remember, a few weeks after the martial rule was instated, the military governor moved to Goma. After a few weeks, we had a volcanic eruption, which we call Nyiragongo. And one answer could be that Nyiragongo could have actually used resources that was affected to fight COVID and conflict to the reconstruction of the city. The other reason could be corruption. As you know, DRC, there is no secret on it. It's one of the highly corrupted country. Just for example, these are houses that were constructed by the military services to relocate people who were affected by the Nyiragongo volcanic eruption. But you can see that after a small rain, all the houses were destroyed. So a question is probably, is the military not able to construct durable houses, or the fund was not directed to the construction of the house? So this is something you see in DRC, that people say that probably the failure could be done because of corruption. And the other reason could be the demonstration effect. So this is, I think, from a theoretical standpoint, I think this question could be very important to explore. Now, what do I call demonstration effect? What we could see is that every time the governor or the president or the prime minister goes to the eastern part of Congo, like in Ituri or North Kivu, where we have those military rule, the day after that, you have other attack from the rebels. So which means that every time the governor or the official government goes to those places, there is more attack. So that's what I'm calling that the demonstration effect. And we can see the demonstration effect in several ways. One way is just looking at the data on child labor. And this data is basically collecting data on how many children are working in those illegal mining, for example. We can see that, and those vertical line in the graph shows you the week before the martial rule was instated. And you can see that in Ituri and North Kivu, where the martial rule was instated, you see that the number of child labor is increasing. So compared to, let's say, South Kivu, where the martial law was not instated. So we can see that, children are still going to work in those illegal mining. So which means that probably the effect could not be that much strong, especially in Ituri. If you look at the data on corruption of fraud, is people who are witnessing corruption reporting to the IPS, you can see that there is still an increase in Ituri. And of course, North Kivu is almost stable, but you see that Ituri is increasing. This is the data of mining-related conflict. You can see in both provinces, you have a really tremendous increase after the rule of law was instated compared to other regions or even South Kivu. And finally, these are roadblocks. So these are illegal barriers put by military or other armed people to stop, movement, flow of people and collecting illegal tax. And what is very important to see here is that looking at Ituri and North Kivu, we can see that there is an increase in the number of roadblocks compared to South Kivu and other places in the DRC. So, and finally, this is just data on violence and FELF, how many people are, victim of violence and everything. And you can see that, especially in North Kivu, after the martial law was instated, you have a peak in North Kivu. Of course, the trend in Ituri is going up, while in South Kivu, it's increasing, but not that much significant. So actually, I took you through this graph and this information, basically to make the case that the DRC has instated a martial law, but which seems not to work well, probably because of it's too early, but also because the other information show us that there is this demonstration effect. So what we want to do in the future, moving forward for this research, of course, is to continue to estimate the impact of martial law using more robust method like synthetic control or event study. But at the same time, we want to explore the practical wisdom and try to do more data collection to try to understand how people are behaving, are becoming more resilient to COVID, especially under the martial rule. So thank you very much for your attention. I'll stop here.
Thank you. Thank you, Otchia Sensei, for the presentation of the program, the martial law. We understand that Congo is facing multiple problems and what we should consider when we conduct research in conflict-affected areas. Thank you very much. So, as the third speaker, as the third speaker, I would invite Professor Seifudein Adem. Adem Sensei is a professor in Graduate School of Global Studies in Doshisha University. Adem Sensei researches on lessons from economic modernization of East Asia and other regions. Adem Sensei, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Hanai Sensei, for your kind introduction. Hello, everyone, and thank you also for coming. Could you hear me, please? Could you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you. And Adem Sensei,
yes,
just start the presentation.
I have shared already.
Yeah, you share.
Okay, great. Yeah. So actually, it is just only one page slide, so it doesn't create any problem. So my presentation is basically about cultural response or cultural answers to COVID-19 in Ethiopia. But I would like to start by clarifying the subtitle, a triple heritage perspective. In doing so, I should also like to point out that I am skipping the overview and the state of vaccination, which Professor Hanai has nicely summarized. So what is Africa's triple heritage? What is Africa's triple heritage? Well, it is a flagship concept of the late Kenyan scholar, Ali Mazrui, which he borrowed from which he borrowed and adapted from Kwame Nkrumah, the first president of Ghana. Nkrumah in turn borrowed and adapted the concept from a man named Edward Blyden, an African-American writer who migrated from the United States to Liberia in the middle of 19th century. Nkrumah saw Africa as the product of three spiritual forces, namely indigenous religions, Islam, and what he called Euro-Christianity. And described his perspective, Nkrumah described his perspective as conscientism in his 1970 book by the same title. Edward Blyden had also articulated a broadly similar view in 1887 in his book titled Christianity, Islam, and the Negro Race. Africa's triple heritage, according to Mazrui, refers simply to the synthesis of three cultural legacies that have shaped Africa: indigenous values, Islam, and Western culture. Mazrui had used this extensively as a framework for analyzing what he saw as the realities of Africa's past, present, and future. It is this perspective which allowed Mazrui to view Africa in three dimensions. Let me give some examples. Continuity and change in Africa could be examined within the three phases of time: pre-colonial, colonial, and post-colonial. The heritage of law could be divided into indigenous customary law, Islamic law, and Western-derived legal system. And the triad of allegiance could be broken down into nation, state, and continent, and so forth. So for the purpose of this presentation, I borrow Mazrui's Africa's triple heritage and adapt it for Ethiopia in my preliminary observations about the cultural response to the outbreak and subsequent spread of COVID-19 in the country. In my view, Ethiopia's triple heritage consists of Christianity, Islam, and secular. There is also a sense in which we could say that Ethiopia's indigenous beliefs are an integral part of the two religions, Islam and Christianity, and are still alive among Muslims and Christians in Ethiopia. How then did the triple heritage, thus defined, so far affected the response to COVID? What is the triple heritage of medicine in this context? I used 4 sources in preparing this presentation: my own casual conversations with family, friends, and colleagues in Ethiopia since the outbreak of the COVID, my own past writings, not on COVID, but on what Ali Mazuri had called Africa's triple heritage, and publicly available information. I have also consulted closely a member of the team of this project. So let's begin with the cultural theories of causation. A disease like COVID, whose cause cannot be seen with a naked eye, is bound to generate new speculation about its causation. But first, denial was the reaction in Ethiopia in the face of the growing concern globally about the disease. For the faithful, Ethiopia is God's country, and COVID has no place in it. But this attitude changed once increasing number of cases began to appear. A shift occurred from, quote, God does not let COVID come to Ethiopia, end of quote, to, quote, Ethiopia is the point of exit from the pandemic itself, end of quote, as therapy and faith healing. Further shift in the understanding about COVID among the faithful in Ethiopia took place when God himself became the cause of COVID, the price for our sins in the judgment of God. In short, God's role has evolved over time from that of the protector against COVID to a healer and finally to its cause. So what is the solution? What is the cure for the afflicted? The wide variety of cultural cures that have been suggested or attempted in some instances have included herbal techniques and traditional medical prescriptions, including a high consumption of garlic. But above all, the faithful was urged to repent for their sins through prayers. And here is where the uneasy relationship between faith and public health policy should enter the discussion. I'm referring here to the tension between public policy and cultural responses. It is assumed that religion and public policy are separate domains, but that is not most of the time the case. It became abundantly clear by the tension that emerged after the outbreak and spread of COVID in the country. An illustrative case in point. It happened after the government of Ethiopia declared a 6-month state of emergency in April 2020. That included the prohibition of group prayers in churches and mosques. For the followers of Christianity and Islam, prayers in groups rather than individually is the most acceptable and therefore recommended form on many occasions. This specific policy of Ethiopia's government was therefore met with stiff resistance initially from the followers of the two religions. But when the effect of the pandemic became clearer and more visible in many neighborhoods and communities, the size of group prayers, funeral attendances, and wedding crowds began to decrease significantly. Also in April, Ethiopia's First Lady released on YouTube a 6-minute gospel song in the Amharic language, in which she begged God to, quote unquote, have mercy on us. Similarly, the president of Ethiopia played host to the leaders of National Orthodox Church and Islamic Council on the occasion of the beginning of a month of prayers. that was just declared by the two entities. In closing, the tentative conclusion we could draw from these observations should include that the line is indeed blurred between the dictates of the two religions on the one hand and secularism of the government on the other. And secondly, a close, if sometimes tense, relationship exists among all three. However, ultimately, the secular medical therapy should take precedence over faith, healing, and the miracles. Are the tensions seen in Ethiopia also present in other African countries? I hope we'll be able to learn more about this from our colleagues in the course of this research project. I'll stop there and thank you very much.
Thank you, Adam Sensei, for explaining the Ethiopia situation in the context of the cultural context. We understand the different dimension of the COVID-19 pandemic. Thank you very much. So then, Adam Sensei or Chihiro-san, could you stop sharing?
Oh, okay.
Okay, thank you very much. So I'd like to invite Inaba-san as a commentator. Inaba-san works as program director of global health in African Japan Forum. We would ask Inaba-san to give comment for our research. Very primitive stage, I understand. There are the very multiple dimensions of the situation in three countries, but if you have any comment, it's very helpful for us. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. My name is Masaki Inaba, and also thank you very much for inviting, and Hanai-san for inviting me, and also thank you very much for Professor Scarlet Cornelissen and Professor Christian Otchia and also Professor Seifudein Adem for your very interesting the lectures. Thank you very much. And I have been working as the Hanai-san introduced. I have been working on health issues and HIV/AIDS and COVID-19 now. As a kind of global health director of the Africa Japan Forum. And also I have been coordinating Japanese civil society working on health for example, the advocacy and also dialogue with the Japanese government as well as international organizations. So I will I will add some aspects on COVID-19 in macro level and also that adding to the very much interesting lectures of the three panelists. I'd like to give some kind of aspects on the more multilateral and also international context on the COVID-19. Yeah, firstly, on South Africa, from the Professor Scarlett, and it was very much interesting that the combination of the success and the challenges, and including lockdown, emergency test distribution, and also currently strong vaccine program, and also that the problem on challenges of education and gender, and long-term social political challenges that make structural impacts in South Africa. And also Professor Christian Otchia I introduced the Democratic Republic of Congo and the martial law especially in the North Kivu and the Ituri and de facto military rule and also human rights violations. And it is interesting that such a strict rule to prevent people's mobility has no effect to prevent wider COVID-19 infection. So we need to collect the information in short and long term on the effectiveness and also harm of this kind of lockdown and also the harsh rule and military rule and with consideration on the political and the social structure in local context. And also the Professor Seifudein Adem, it was very much interesting that in the African, considering COVID-19 from the African, the spiritual aspects of COVID-19, especially in the indigenous values, Islam and Western Christianity. And also that it is very much also interesting that the tension between public health measures and the cultural values or secularism and faith-based approach. And this kind of, the analysis is very important so that we learned so much, I learned so much from your perspectives. So, and due to the COVID-19 pandemic, a variety of previously hidden problems and also previously hidden conflicts have become visible on global, regional, and national and local level. And for example, the weakness of the health systems and also non-existence of integration between health and medical services, social welfare and public assistance programs and care. It is not only in Africa, but also in, for example, in the US or UK or Japan or Europe, especially in the high-income countries. There have been the impact of the low investment for the public health and also infectious diseases measures in these kind of high-level, high-income countries. So that, for example, the United States has the biggest number of deaths under the COVID-19 pandemic. And also deepened crisis of syndemic, and it is also very much important issues. That means that the synthesis of the diverse elements that harms people's health that develop huge negative social impacts, especially in urban poor population in Latin America, Middle East, South Asia, and also Africa, especially South African urban districts. And also lack of resilience in diverse dimensions of society and politics in every society, difficulty to secure social and political integration, including the misinformation and fake news. But in this context, we can see the unique strengths of Africa, especially in continental level, especially on the global policy making to resist global inequality on access to health and medical services between rich and poor, and develop initiatives to fill the gap of demands and supplies of COVID-19 tools, including vaccines, and prepare for the development of next generation pandemic preparedness and response after COVID-19. And I will share some slides. Wait for a moment. This one. Okay. You know that, how to say, this one. Just wait for a moment. This one. So you know that the ACT accelerator or access to COVID-19 accelerator, and it was established in April 24 last year, just after 1 month of the pandemic declaration of the WHO. And it is the kind of the unique, coalition of the international organizations and the private foundations, and with the key countries, and including the African Union, and it is co-chaired by the President Cyril Ramaphosa of South Africa, and also the Norway's Prime Minister. It consists of the 3 pillars of the vaccines and also therapeutics and the diagnostics, and also the health system connector. It is from the research and development to distribution of the new COVID-19 tools to fight, and also that fill the gap of the access to these kind of the health services. It is very much rapid development. Only 1 month after pandemic declaration, despite the U.S. president was the US president of the United States was Donald Trump, and so that it was a very much unique achievement of the global multilateral efforts. But unfortunately, this ACT accelerator was very much failure on collecting the money. And still, it has the 166 so this is the 16.6 billion US dollars in total on the therapeutics and diagnostic and health systems, and also that and also vaccines. So that unfortunately, it has not been effectively delivering the the diagnostics and also the therapeutics like oxygen and also the testing. So that currently still very big gaps are there between the rich country and poor country, especially, for example, the sub-Saharan African countries, and also the high-income countries. And also about vaccines, unfortunately, because of the Indians, the tragedy, and Indian big company and Serum Institute of India and has been producing the huge number of vaccines that it was consumed by India in domestically. So that it was not went to the to COVAX, and unfortunately it was not has delivered to Africa and also other poor countries which are eligible for the COVAX services. So that how to say the after the May this year, the services of COVAX was almost stopped. So this is a very much difficult situation. So that how to say on last October, the India and South Africa proposed the a proposal of the TRIPS waiver and intellectual property rights protection waiver proposal to the WTO, and it got the very much strong support from especially the developing world, and so that currently 61 countries, including Africa group and also the least developed countries group, co-proposed, and also most of the WTO member countries supported the proposal. And after that, for example, May 5th, the United States government changed its attitude for the proposal, and it decided to support this proposal to waiver. So currently the very much big transition has been starting from the intellectual property rights oriented and trade system, especially on the medical issues, and to the more common goods approach has been starting this kind of transition. So it is very much important. And also, this kind of transition is led by African leaders like WHO's Tedros Adhanom, and also WTO's and Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, and also the South African President Ramaphosa. For example, Tedros has been raising the very strong words on the vaccine apartheid, like the world is on the brink of the catastrophic moral failure. And also and he also said that he appreciates G7 for 100 million doses of vaccine donation, but the world needs 11 billion doses. So such kind of strong word affected much people and raised people's attention on the vaccine gap, and also that the medical and the health gap in the world, and also that and these kind of people led the African-led initiatives, like for example, African Vaccines Acquisition Task Team, and it is led by African Union Vaccine Envoy Strive Masiwa, and it is that 400 million J&J vaccines finished by and filled by Aspen Pharmaceuticals. And also WHO-led African messenger RNA vaccine technology transfer hub, and it is the South African Afrigen and the BioVac. It is the two companies which can make the vaccines. And also that the Pfizer was very much afraid about this initiative, and it contracted with the BioVac to finish and fill its vaccines for Africa. And I'll say a problem of vaccine hesitancy that has historical roots. It is also a difficult point. So anyway, I would like to so I will finish the issue and my comments. But anyway, please wait for a moment. And this one, we have the challenges like vaccine hesitancy that have the historical roots. And this historical roots that the African Union has been leading the African Vaccine Delivery Alliance, and a CSO called African Alliance, based in South Africa, that started serving the role of community engagement and risk communication. It says that it needs to consider the historical influence of the crimes of the colonialism and racism in Africa to liberate people from vaccine hesitancy, and they will take strategy on this context. And also economic and political social impact on COVID-19, governance has been gradually eroded, and also conflict has been emerged in countries that have weakness in governance. And anyway, macro, continental, multilateral level, there has been a dynamic leadership, and from Africa, but there have been contradiction in national and local level. We need to solve this challenge, and we also need to make strong efforts and develop a continental and global level mechanisms for global health solidarity and for pandemic preparedness and responses. So thank you very much. Sorry for the long intervention.
Thank you, Inaba-san, for sharing the global dimension. Trend of the vaccination, and thank you for very thought-provoking comment. So now I'd like to move to the Q&A session. We received the 3 questions. The twos are to Scarlet Sensei, and one is to the Christian. It means the Otchia Sensei. So Scarlet Sensei, could you see the Q&A box? Yeah, I will read the question. The first question is, kindly highlight which age group is more affected by the pandemic in your country, and what age is more resistant to infections. The second question is that elucidate of people's perception on the risk with vaccination, especially where it has been suspended. Could the risks in vaccination create more lives than the pandemic in the near future? Yeah, could you answer these questions?
Yeah, thank you, Juliet, for these very interesting and actually challenging questions. So the first question, it's been shifting. And the pattern has been quite similar as the infection patterns have been in other parts of the world. So in the beginning, people mostly in the senior age group were the ones who, and still are the ones who are most vulnerable, and younger people, as the knowledge at the time wasn't so developed in terms of the nature of the disease. Younger people were considered to be not so vulnerable, and that they could be resistant to the worst illness that the virus can cause. But that's been shifting, and that's been the case all over the world. So we in South Africa, we're also seeing younger people now being infected. Actually, the largest cohort of people who are being affected are young people. I think I read now just today, people in the age group of 15 to 25, so it's getting younger and younger and younger, but that's not unique. The South African situation is not unique. In terms of the second question, people's perception, yes. So again, this should be really investigated sort of comprehensively, because perceptions have also been shifting over time regarding vaccines and so forth. So vaccine hesitancy is quite healthy across all income groups and people from all social backgrounds in South Africa. So people who are the vegan eating upper middle class persons are as skeptical about vaccines, or have been as skeptical about vaccines as have people who are not as materially well off. So I can't give you a precise answer to that. And then whether I'm not sure about what you mean with where it's been suspended. It hasn't been suspended in South Africa. So the vaccine program has rolled out, and it's continuing. There hasn't been any kind of suspension, except where in the early days there were some questions about the physiological impacts of I think it was the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, yeah, but that was then reintroduced. And whether there's fear that the vaccine could claim more lives than the pandemic, I am of the opinion that vaccines save lives. I'm going to use this platform to make that point, that I do not think you should take your chances with the pandemic, with the virus. I think, and I speak out of experience here. So when we look at the figures of the more than 81,000 persons who have died, many of them are family and are friends and are colleagues, and they're dying on a daily basis. So my answer to you is, vaccines save lives, and that message should be distributed to everybody. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Scarlet Sensei. So then the third question is to Otchia Sensei. There is a highlight of migrant refugees from DRC to neighboring countries, apart from natural disasters like Congo eruption. Do you think this is resilience to the pandemic in your country? Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much, Juliet. This is also a very interesting question. I think refugee from DRC is not new to us. There is a long story of refugee from DRC. And actually, I've visited many countries. Even when I visited Ethiopia, actually, I met many refugees from DRC, and people thought I was also a refugee. But, you know, what I mean by the resilience here is that even people who flee from natural disaster from Nyiragongo, they went to Goma, they came to Rwanda, Gisenyi, many of them came back. So when I show in the graph, the map I showed, you see a big variation within the country. That the rate of COVID, especially contamination cases, is very low in DRC. Compared to the 6 countries we are studying here. I think DRC has the lowest number of contaminated cases. And those cases are widespread, not over the country, but in very few regions. So whether DRC is resilient to pandemic, I think this is probably what this research is all about. First, to understand whether people have been resilient, especially those who have faced Ebola and other conflict. How did they use the knowledge they learn from Ebola and malaria and other disease to cope with COVID? And your question is what we all about for this research. So probably I will give you a correct answer in a few years after we complete this research. But thank you very much for your question.
Thank you, Otchia Sensei. Then I'd like to close the first session. Thank you, Scarlet Sensei, Otchia Sensei, Adem Sensei, and Inaba Sensei. Thank you very much. So now I'd like to move on to the second session. In the second session, we focus more on politicization of government responses. So the first speaker of the second session is Professor Ssali. Yeah, I would like to invite the Ssali Sensei. Ssali Sensei is a lecturer in Department of English Language and Cultures at Aichi Gakuin University, and our president of our association, Japan Society for Asian Studies. Ssali Sensei, you have the floor, please.
Yes, thank you very much, Hanai Sensei. I've already introduced myself at length, and I am representing the group that is focusing on Uganda. And we seek in our group to capture the priorities and responses made by the government of Uganda, starting roughly from March 20th last year. And in the process, we reflect on the people's experiences and resilience. Uganda's initial response, I have to say, was rapid and really great in many ways. And I think it was informed by her previous experiences and successes with other pandemics like Ebola. You can see from this timeline, for example, that Uganda only reached the 100 mark in May, 2 months into the pandemic. And the first COVID-related death was announced only on July 23rd. But it was remarkable that by the same date of July 23rd, 12 people had already died in the hands of the armed forces who were enforcing lockdown curfews, probably more. Those are the ones we knew. So many people started to look at the pandemic and the strict measures with really not many, or in some communities, no known cases around them. And so they began to see the pandemic and COVID itself as a political tool than a reality. That was a very unfortunate beginning in the case of Uganda. But the government continued to over-police, as you can see in this image. And the main reason people came to relate to this was that this was the year of elections in Uganda. So the incumbent was facing a very youthful party, which was challenging his 35-year rule. And so everything that was taking place was seen in the light of politics and campaigning and elections. For example, people saw the monopoly of the government in distributing COVID relief as a campaigning tool. So there were cases of where opposition politicians were beaten up when they tried to give some relief to their constituents. The opposition also saw a lot of restrictions on their campaign activities in the same light. So they didn't believe in COVID. They just saw politics. And that was unfortunate. And as Adem Sensei said, in Africa, there is causation. The philosophy of causation is everywhere. I can say now, and we can tell him more after the research, but I can answer a bit from my background. So people look at causes. And so that was a very unfortunate causation people put on COVID from the beginning. So the politicking continued and the running battles continued, and Uganda saw one of its worst campaign violence-filled campaigns in history. At one incident in November, 54 people, probably more, were shot at the streets of Kampala, protesting against the arrest of their leading opposition candidate. And the police was, of course, dispersing people to prevent COVID and so on, to keep the COVID SOPs and so on. Given that the masses had now become kind of skeptical and they had to make ends meet anyway, and the semi-lockdown was continuing, and there was this craze with election campaigning, it was inevitable that the peak of the first phase of COVID in Uganda came with the peak of the election campaigns around November, December, January. But around the same time, prominent people were dying of COVID, and they were announcing it. I put two images here, but a leading Catholic bishop, for example, a deputy prime minister, they were dying of COVID, and probably people saw that as a awakening call, and so the curve kind of flattened after that. But there are many other factors that would lead to a second phase that was inevitable. In March, after 1 year, schools were reopened, and there was the onset of new variants, as it was the case in the world over. And there was this tension of observing SOPs and making ends meet in a country where a big percentage, almost over 40%, live below the poverty line. So the second wave came, and it was worse than the first. So a second lockdown was inevitable, and it was a complete lockdown in mid-June, and it lasted until the beginning of August. Schools remained closed. They remain closed up to now, and they may not be opened according to the government, when the teachers have been vaccinated. But that's a long shot, because really the rates of vaccinations are also very low. And I think Hanai Sensei gave a good picture of Africa. Uganda is no exception. The percentages are very low. The cost of living is biting, because people, when they are locked down, they live from hand to mouth. They can't work. Caring for the sick, who have increased, also has been a big challenge. And the only wave, the second wave relief to poor families was only 100,000. I could say pity 100,000 shillings, just about $30. So our co-researcher on the ground gave this beautiful summary, which I wanted to show here, about the socioeconomic dilemmas the people are facing. A stagnant economy mainly affects the most marginalized. There is reported increased taxation instead of any reasonable rollout of COVID relief. That's a contradiction from the part of the leadership. And the school closure is becoming a fatigue. So our co-researcher mentioned that actually school structures are being sold off. So people have lost hope of going back to school. Teachers have lost hope. Students have lost hope. And there are all types of social moral problems, including especially premature abortions. Some of them are even incestuous. And so the moral fiber of society is also breaking down. There have been some good news during this second phase. Ugandans celebrated because one of their own, Dr. Patrick Ogwanga, is a professor at Mbala University of Technology, and he's a leading herbal researcher. And he tested and found that Covidex was a relief, as he called his medicine, Covidex. It's a relief for COVID-related symptoms. So many Ugandans believed, on the other hand, that this was a definitive cure. So they had hopes, sort of hopes. And he was thinking about Ugandans, and he put the price at around 6,000 Ugandan shillings, just over $1.5, which is manageable by many people. But although people believe in that, there was quite a few unfortunate interventions, and now it's not readily available or affordable. So I will wind up with two practical recommendations: that the country needs more sensitization of the masses than the unlimited use of armed forces for breakdowns and curfew enforcement. Also, that we learned from Uganda that the pandemics like the one going on are not political games, but governments simply have to put their hearts and money where they should be. In conclusion, one could say that there are still a few dark days ahead as COVID is still rampaging. And as WHO is predicting, a third wave might be coming across the continent. And we haven't done the research so far, but we hear a lot of stories, and our co-researchers on the ground, the anecdotes they give us point to a pandemic as well as a crisis in governance. So we conclude that government commitment, as well as the people's wisdom and resilience, will continue to be tested by this pandemic. So our inquiries into grassroots perceptions and narratives in Uganda will inevitably be dominated by these themes: commitment, consistency on the part of government, and resilience and practical wisdom on the part of the masses. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Sari Sensei, for your thoughtful presentation. Thank you. Oh, so sorry. Thank you very much. So I'd like to invite the second speaker. The second speaker is Dr. Kiyo Kisinji. Kisinji-san is a research fellow in the Institute of African, Asian, and Middle Eastern Studies at Sophia University. Kisinji-san currently researches on engagement of the youth in rural Africa with the digital platform, namely social medias and mobile money transactions. Kisinji-san, you have the floor, please.
Thank you very much, Hanai Sensei. I'm going to be presenting on a topic I am calling politics of scapegoating and fatigue during COVID-19 pandemic in Kenya. I will make those two terms clear during my presentation. Now, when COVID-19 was first reported in Kenya in early 2020, several protocols were put in place to curb the spread of the virus. This included lockdowns and curfews, but they also included economic stimulus that were meant to cushion Kenyans adversely affected by the COVID preventive measures. As the state measures were announced, Kenyans were required to acquire new habits and behavior changes. Most visible in this category were the requirements to wear face masks and also practice hand washing and sanitization in public spaces. As most of these protocols were alien to daily livelihoods and cultures, use of force by the state was justified to ensure that everyone adhered to them. Thus, simple acts like putting on a mask gave the police power to arrest ordinary citizens. As a result, extortion by the police has increased as they collect bribes from petty offenders. Another critical area that gave the police unregulated authority was the curfews. It is during the curfews that the brutal hand of the police has been witnessed. Several cases of police brutality has been recorded in the past year, and citizens have responded to this police brutality with protest and anger. This picture here shows one of the cases of such protests, which I will explain in the coming slides. Since the police brutality in Kenya is not unique to the season of COVID-19 pandemic, how then can we understand the police brutality, the protest, and other related circumstances that the pandemic seems to be laying bare? My thesis in this presentation is that as political competition towards 2022 general elections heats up, two key issues have emerged as important, and they require much attention. These two issues are that the COVID-19 crisis has caused fatigue among those disenfranchised, and that the political class is keen to identify who is the scapegoat as they mobilize for electoral campaigns in 2022. This mobilization has enabled the emergence of two key opposing rhetorics, one that identifies with the downtrodden using the symbol of a wheelbarrow as a symbol of the ordinary people, and the other one is a group accused by those purporting to have a new strategy to curb economic woes, claiming the prominence of political families who have wielded power since independence as partly to blame for the difficult times. In the light of that, let us now closely look at the current context by examining two concepts, which are fatigue and scapegoating. Fatigue is a socio-political condition created by familiarity and tiredness from repeated warnings and narratives. It is seen in falling levels of trust in politicians, experts, institutions, and it may weaken political and social structures. Fatigue can be seen in many situations under pandemic where many people are not abiding anymore to the set protocols and are not taking into account the official announcements. The public seems to be getting immune to warnings by the state and following the habitually distrustful politicians. On its part, scapegoating is a concept from ancient Jewish rituals, from Christian perspectives, the book of Leviticus, where a goat was ritually burdened with the sins of the Jews. This ritual was done to create a substitute victim to take frailties and various. In simple terms, we can think of scapegoating as projecting onto another the blame for the problems faced. Rin Girard, who explains this concept of scapegoating, stated as various rituals that use the victim as an atonement. In this ritual, the innocent carries the sin of the multitude. How then are we using the concept of scapegoating in this work? According to Girard, the target is not chosen because it is responsible for the society's woes, but rather because it is easy to victimize without fear of retaliation. Girard argues that the purpose of scapegoating is to polarize the community, aggressive impulses, and redirect them toward victims that may be actual or figurative, but that are always incapable of propagating further the violence. In the case of Kenya, the scapegoat is not yet clearly determined yet, and therefore we can only identify the foundational factors that may facilitate the choice of a scapegoat. And to do this, the ensuing fatigue does enable us to make a conclusion that in 2022 political competition, there may be a choice of such a scapegoat. In order to analyze the 3 points that I have raised above, and that is the people and what kind of grievances they have and what kind of victims are chosen, then we need to pay attention to issues that are emerging during the political and social uncertainties under COVID-19. One of these key issues is unemployment or loss of employment opportunities, like in many other countries. And the slide here shows some data from FinAccess about job opportunities that were lost in the previous months. Another 2 prominent issues that have been occurring are corruption and police brutality. As you can see on this slide, I tried to collect the cases of police brutality that have been highlighted in various social media networks. As a result, as I stated in the beginning, state force was necessary to ensure the success implementation of COVID-19 protocols. And one of the target area misused by the police has been the curfew that currently runs from 10 p.m. to 4 a.m. in the morning. The curfew is one of the few remaining COVID-19 protocols that are still in place up to date. Several people have become victims of police brutality under coverage of curfew protocols. Some of these victims experience sex offenses, but death by killing by the police is the most common. The most brutal was the cold-blooded killing of two brothers named Mutura and Jiro, as you can see them on the pictures, on 1st August 2021 at their village in Kiajokoma, Embu. These 2 college students were caught up by the police on their way home after a fruitful day of setting up a new business 30 kilometers away from their parents' house. And their death brought major uproar and grassroots-driven protest that lasted for days, causing uneasiness not only in the village, but also countrywide, and traded in various social media platforms. The protests accused the police of taking advantage of many people during the curfew hours and citing that they had killed several people, other people before these particular incidents. Now, while people were protesting, they were joined also by political leaders and both local and national. The politicians' speech carried the undertones of what the politicians are calling wheelbarrow economics and dynasty economics. So this seems to be the responses from the political class. The attempts to respond to Kyanjokoma brothers by the political class is characteristic of the political environment that has been developing under COVID-19. This particular response does provide the answer to who is becoming the scapegoat. The political solution for the economic, social, and political turmoils in pandemic is unfolded within two major clusters. One seeks to maintain the status quo from the political families, and this is an initiative by the president and the opposition leader who are building the so-called Building Bridges initiative to restructure the constitution and also to enlarge political representation. The other promises an economic revival with what they are calling wheelbarrow economics, a sign of bottom-up economic model. So in conclusion, at this stage, various political actors are scapegoating the pandemic while using the woes caused by it to consolidate political support. For instance, the Kyanjokoma protest was usurped by the Hustler Nation, who, despite being part of the state for a long time, sided with the protesters as their sympathizers. Scapegoating the pandemic complicates the notion of politics of scapegoating, as it cannot clearly be termed as the victim. But this is also opening up a political contestation that may clearly help us to identify the scapegoats towards 2022 political competition as it unfolds, which is going to be important in the research of political behaviors and pandemic in Kenya. Thank you very much for listening. I welcome questions and concerns.
Yeah, thank you, Kishindi-san, for explaining the background of brutality and related response and rising important issue of politics of scapegoating. Thank you very much. Thank you. So I'd like to invite the third speaker. The third speaker of the second session is Dr. Rangadai Machetu-san. Yeah, usually we call him Ranga-san. So the Ranga-san is an assistant in Graduate School of Global Studies at Doshisha University. Ranga-san researches on agriculture cooperative development in Japan and Zimbabwe. So Ranga-san, you have the floor, please.
All right, thank you, Chair. I first of all want to thank you because now my much of the work has already been done. When you present last year, it's just a matter of putting the final seams on the garment. But my presentation today is titled, let me just share my screen. Okay, can you see my screen?
Yes, we can see.
Okay. My presentation today is titled Farmers' Perception of the Effects of COVID-19 on Agricultural Markets and Livelihoods in Zimbabwe. So as within the broad project, this particular research is kind of trying to compare the inter-country or intra-country differences maybe between the urban areas and the rural areas, and how the differences in their realities affect their perception of COVID-19 in the country. So the topic that I will present today is farmers' perception of the effect of COVID-19 on agricultural markets. So I think we are all, also running out of time, so I will try to go as quickly as possible. I want to talk about the government policy measures and then people's responses, and then talk briefly about the COVID-19 and the possible differences that we may think of between the city and the rural areas. Talk a bit about the situation on misinformation, politics, and abuse of privileges during the COVID pandemic. Talk a bit about vaccinations and expected effects on farmers in Zimbabwe. I'm going to quickly skip through this one because I think Hanai Sensei has already given us a kind of a broader picture of the cases and the COVID situation in terms of numbers in Zimbabwe. Yeah, same thing. On this one, probably I would like just to comment on how, if you look at maybe the fatality rates between Zimbabwe, Japan, and South Africa. In the initial stages, there were a lot of, for Zimbabwe, the mortality was really high, and the Zimbabwe government had to try to do a lot of measures to reduce this fatality rate. And one of the things, as I will discuss later, that they used was very strict lockdowns. Right, so jumping right into it, government responses have mainly been, first and foremost, lockdowns. And they were really strict, and the government set up different checkpoints and roadblocks to kind of monitor the movement of people within the city and from one province to the next province as a way of reducing the movement of people and the spread of the coronavirus. And then from then they started some testing and mandatory quarantines for positive cases. And for those people that were severely affected, there had been a lot of hospitalization of serious cases. And in this case, you start to discuss about some of the issues that the virus brought out in terms of how the state of the health sector in the country. So the materials and equipment in hospitals was at some point overwhelmed by the number of cases, although this is generally the same story across the world. But Zimbabwe has been seriously affected by it. And then later on, the government started to roll out the vaccinations. And it has also been trying to do serious public awareness campaigns, both in the city and in the rural areas through different platforms, radio, TV, and social media. But unlike in South Africa, like what Professor Scarlet presented, Zimbabwe did not have formal economic bailouts for its citizens. So for some of us who are lucky to be in Japan, we managed to get some economic bailouts. This graph, I just wanted to show the daily new confirmed cases, but I think Hanai Sensei has talked about this. But just to add on to that, is to give kind of results that came out of the different lockdowns that the government managed to do. So if you look at the first lockdown, it was more of like informed by a lot of fear, so to speak, not much information. So the first thing that the government just thought of doing is to lock down, even though the number of cases were not so much. The second lockdown was a direct response to increasing number of cases in the country. And then after the lockdown, it started to go down. And then the third lockdown again is also kind of a response to increasing number of cases. This pattern is obviously the same across many countries across the world, but I just wanted to show it up here again. On this graph also to reinforce the same point, But I just wanted also to present this kind of index that is available on our world in data, which is kind of, which talks about the stringency level of different countries in terms of the measures that they implemented or they used on its citizens. So if you look at this one is the Zimbabwe measure, and for the greater part, it was averaging around 80% in 80. So 0 means not so strict, and then 100 is very strict measures that have been put by the government. So in the, Zimbabwe has been performing, has been very strict in terms of its measures that it has used on the COVID-19 pandemic. And then I just put the Japanese data just to compare and compare between Japan and Zimbabwe to show that Japan has been low in terms of its strict levels, but generally most countries in Africa and Southern Africa have been very strict in terms of their response measures. So we talk of Uganda, Kenya, South Africa, and Zimbabwe. Okay, then quickly jumping to people's local responses. People initially started with denials, and they had a lot of conspiracy theories, and they talked a lot about, you know, I think everyone has read a lot of stories about how the vaccine could be used to genetically modify our genome and things like that. So there were a lot of stories that were happening in Zimbabwe, and a lot of people did not believe that the virus actually existed. But then there was a very popular socialite, very popular person called Zororo Makamba. When they passed away after returning from the United States or the UK, that's when people actually started to it was kind of a rude awakening, although some people still remained skeptical in terms of what was happening. It is at this time that we had a lot of kind of local remedies because the vaccination was still not available. So we had a lot of remedies. We have what people call in Zimbabwe kunatira, which is basically steaming yourself. You know, you boil some water, you cover yourself with a blanket, and then you steam yourself, and then you can throw in some Lipia javanica, which is in Zimbabwe is called zumbani. Before the coronavirus, some people drink it as a tea, but after the coronavirus, they believe that it has medicinal purposes for against corona. Other things, gum tree leaves, methanol vapor rubs, ginger, lemon, and garlic. And then, of course, with the time, there's been an acceptance that the virus actually exists, and then some level of self-consciousization and self-care at the individual level. So here I just wanted to bring out my main argument, or the main argument that I'm trying to move with in this research, which is to kind of bring out the intra-country differences, especially between the rural and the city. And initially, I'm conceptualizing that we will have a lot of differences to how people perceive or what the real effects of COVID-19 would be on socio-economic factors. And I think a lot of the fact that the underlying health issues will be different between rural areas and the city, vulnerability in terms of health and also economics, socio-economic wise, you find out that the rural areas are usually more vulnerable to economic and socio-political shocks. So you would expect a lot of differences in terms of how people perceive the virus in terms of vulnerability. Of course, access to health facilities, community resilience. I expect a lot of differences between the city and the rural areas. Education, of course, in terms of how people access information and their vulnerability to fake news. I expect differences within this. But then within this conceptualization, I also thought it would be important to recognize that there are intra-city or intra-rural area differentiation. So within the rural areas itself, there will be some differences, and within the city itself, there will be some differences. I put this graph just to show the differences in terms of movement of people from when the virus hit Zimbabwe until maybe May, in terms of how people were visiting or going to such places as grocery and pharmacy stores, workplaces, parks, and so forth. I'll quickly jump to misinformation and politicization and abuse of COVID-19 situations. And I think this slide speaks a lot to Kenywa and Ssali-san's presentations. We have had a lot of, as I said before, conspiracies, and social media has been there's been a lot of issues raised through social media. We have had some influencers speaking quite dangerous words or spreading dangerous information. Such people as even religious leaders who were skeptical about the coronavirus and vaccination processes, and they've been saying a lot of misinformation about which was to the detriment of the fight against the virus. Also within this, I want to talk about the manifestation of the MDC and ZANU-PF. These are the major ruling parties, big parties in Zimbabwe. ZANU-PF being the ruling party, and MDC being the main opposition. So you find that a lot of the whatever measures that have been put in place have kind of been opposed by the opposition party, whether commenting that it's wrong or it's late or it's too slow or things like that. So there's been some you see the differences in politics in terms of how to handle the coronavirus. And of course, we have reports of corruption. Some elites and ZANU-PF members have been known to disregard COVID-19 restrictions. They hold rallies, they hold meetings, they hold parties. While some people who were demonstrating against some repression of the opposition people were actually arrested, even though they were wearing masks and kind of protesting in a safe and COVID-19 sensitive manner. And of course, there's been some people who have been selling essential worker permits. So if you want to move around during lockdowns, you need a permit. And then so there's been a premium on this. And of course, there's been politicization of the vaccine rollout. Many people that are getting vaccination, especially in the rural areas, they have a mentality that this vaccine is coming from ZANU-PF, the ruling party, and the whole issue of it being a government program has been looked down upon. In terms of the vaccine, the Sinovac has been mostly used, but there's been a lot of suspicion in terms of the China-Zimbabwe relations, which resulted in initial resistance to the vaccine. But now the vaccine is undersupplied, and we have long queues with some not even getting the vaccines. And also I wanted to raise this issue that there's been some reports of vaccines for children from 14 years old, maybe as a way to enable safety in schools or to reopen the schools. As a challenge, there's been a big challenge in terms of securing the second doses on time. But this is not just a problem in Zimbabwe, but also across the continent. We've had some reports from, for example, there is a guy called Strive Masiwa. He's a leader of the African task force to try to procure vaccines. He said that the EU has vaccine factories. It has vaccine production centers across Europe, but not a single dose, not one vial has left a European factory for Africa. When we have gone to talk to their manufacturers to buy the vaccine, not to beg for the vaccine, but to buy the vaccine, they tell us that they are completely maxed out on meeting the needs of Europe. I'm going to quickly skip on this because I think I've talked about it already. Here also, this was just to show the trajectory that Zimbabwe has taken on administering vaccines. And the second picture just compares Zimbabwe and other countries. Finally, as a way of concluding, what I expect to find when we do this research is that I think it's going to be for the rural areas, for the farmers in Zimbabwe, it's going to be more of an economic hazard or a threat rather than a health threat that is COVID-19. So the restrictions and lockdowns, they stop mobility of goods. Mobility of goods means poor access to inputs because farmers cannot go to areas where they usually buy inputs. Access to labor and off-farm work. So if you cannot move from one farm to the next, it means you can't get labor to work on your farm. Or if you are a person who relies on working on other farms, you cannot go to other areas to look for work. And of course, there will be some social effects. Okay.
Okay, thank you much.
Stop here. Sorry for
Langa-san.
taking too much time. Okay.
Thank you very much, Langa-san, for very detailed presentation on the local situation in Zimbabwe. Thank you very much. So because of the time constraints, I'd like to directly move to the Q&A, but we receive only one question from the participants. The question is to the Kinyo-san. Kinyo-san, do you see the question? Yeah, I will read. The Kenya-san, was the curfew in Kenya countrywide or was phrased according to countries? Yeah, could you answer this question?
Okay, thank you very much to the person asking the question, Sembogerere. I hope I pronounced that one right. So currently the curfew that is in place is nationwide, that begins from 10 p.m. to 4 a.m. But previously, there have been various measures that different counties applied different measures depending on the number of cases that were reported. So for example, there was a time where people were prevented from moving or entering into the Nairobi metropolitan area. There were other times also where Mombasa, Kisumu, and Nairobi and their own specific regulation on curfews. So the curfews in the past have been depending on the number of cases, but currently the curfew in place applies nationwide. That's why it affects even in the most affects the most remote of the places. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kinyo-san. Thank you very much. So all presentations are very fruitful, and so that it's already the time to end this seminar. I think after listening to the presentation on 6 countries and Inaba-san's comment, I think we now deepen our understanding on multi-dimensions of the problems facing African countries. I believe. So thank you very much for your cooperation. So today's seminar is a kickoff of our research project. So that the presentations and our discussion is not so coherent at this stage, but maybe the next next seminar, we can show more structurized our researches. Thank you very much. Oh, and I apologize for the extended this seminar. Thank you very much for the cooperation. Thank you. for the participants and the panelists, could you show your face? Yeah, could you switch on your video? Okay, thank you very much. Yeah, lastly, I would like to express my gratitude to the support staff who helped organize this seminar. Thank you very much. And for the panelists, Ranga-san, Otchia sensei, Kinyura-san, Ssali sensei, Adem sensei, and the commentator, Inaba-san. And unfortunately, the Scarlet sensei already left this seminar, but I think we can have this more deep discussion the next time. Thank you very much. Thank you. So I'd like to finish our seminar.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.